Healing begins with God's love. Healing starts with God's love.
Amen.
The Bible says in 1 John 4:8, God is love. We call love what his actions are, but love is his very substance. So when we accept Christ, we are filled with a well of living water, which is God's Spirit, ready to cleanse us. He's ready to cleanse us. You have to accept that love. What hinders God from healing these injuries to our self-image is that we put obstacles up to avoid the flow of God's cleansing love. But through God's wisdom, we can tear down these obstacles. We can remove them from our lives so we can heal from our emotional injuries and embrace God's beautiful love for ourselves. The Bible says, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." The problem is just that. They don't have self-esteem. They're self-condemning or self-destructive. So in true reality, they are treating others how they treat themselves. They are doing what it says. So the first step is to learn to love yourself. Learning to embrace God's love is a foundation so that we can learn to love others.
Amen.
Keep in mind that man's betrayal of love starts in the betrayal of self-love, which is based on misconceptions of what other people's actions mean to you. Now, let's talk about God's love. Because we want God's love to permeate our every fiber, our body, our mind, and our souls. In Galatians 2:20, it says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." In Matthew 16:24, it says, in order to allow God's love to totally control you, you must take up the cross and deny yourself.
Amen.
Where man's love is filtered through self-centeredness, God's love is unrestrained and totally not self-centered. God's love purifies the affection that you have in all of your relationships. If it be dad, if it be for a child, if it be for a spouse, if it be for an ex-spouse, if it be for a parent, if it be for an animal, or even your enemy. God's love purifies your emotion from someone that is your enemy. God's love is always what is best for the other person or the overall good.
Amen.
God's love is not challenged by the other person's actions, but is founded on wisdom and the understanding of the other person.
Amen.
God's love is guided by fundamental principles. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, the Bible says, "Do not be yoked together with unbelievers," which means someone who has not put their trust in God. It also says, "Do not fellowship with darkness." This is not God's disdain for those who live in darkness, but an expression of love for them. For example, you may love someone, such as a family member, friend, and you want them saved. But there are limitations of the fellowship because of certain principles. It is not self-centered. It is not a selfish act. It is not self-centered to protect yourself, but is based on a few factors. 1, you need to be a good example to the person in darkness. So once you reach them, their spiritual life will not be entangled by fellowshipping with darkness, but instead they will follow your example to naught. This is true love, not to fellowship with them. And 2, if you're the hope of that person, if you're the hope of that person, if you do fellowship with darkness, and you do fall, then what hope does that other person have that they have placed in you? God's love flowing through you purifies your perception of people that may offend you, that may hurt you, or that are living failed lives. We look at wickedness or evil differently than what God does. We look at the person that is an alcoholic as a sinner. But God sees the drinking as a fever or a symptom of an injured heart. The word wickedness in Greek means suffering or tormented. And the word evil is translated from 2 different words: hurtful and worthless. This is what a lot of people feel like that are living in sin. Worthless or useless. When we hear a person cussing, yelling, and saying hurtful things, we But God sees them crying out in anguish. When somebody criticizes us, our love is suppressed, it withdraws, and is threatened. But God's love measures that person's criticism of their self by the criticism they share with others. Man's love is suppressed when someone slaps them in the face emotionally. But God's love receives that slap and returns it with love, with concern, with compassion, and with patience. Man's love, when challenged, creates division and strife, breaks up marriages, separates husband from wife, sisters from brothers, parents from children, and children from parents. But God's love takes those hearts and melts them into one and heals the injury. Man's love is threatened by the differences in people. But God's love understands the differences and finds strength, unity, and similarities in the differences. For 2,000 years, God has searched for vessels that will yield themselves to Him and let Him pour His love into their hearts, into their souls, and to their minds. So that His love could bring about such a unity that it would be like a magnet and draw people to Him.
Amen.
This unity would be like a sanctuary where people would feel safe from condemnation, from criticism, and from hurt. Satan has used every strategy he can find to distract, to divide, and to conquer. He has used temptation, preying upon our desires that come from our suffering hearts. He has used materialism to drown us in useless possessions and empty promises, starving our souls